Q&A. So welcome, everyone. I'm Zsuzsa Csergő, Director of Virtual vASN, and I'm delighted to welcome you at this webinar, which brings together internationally well-known scholars to discuss a very important theme in nationalism studies, which is the relationship between religion and nationalism. And this discussion has been prompted by a recent article that was published in Nationalities Papers, the Journal of vASN, as a state-of-the-art article that discusses where we are, where the field stands on the question of how religion and nationalism relate to each other. It was written by Şener Aktürk. And so he is here to present his thoughts from that article, followed by commentaries by experts who have read the article and have done extensive work in nationalism studies and religion. And so I am going to give over the virtual floor to Peter Rutland, who is going to start moderating the conversation. And I would just like to remind everyone that we are going to make this as participatory as possible. We have the privilege of a large audience, so we will not be able to bring you on screen, but please use the Q&A feature to enter your questions, and they will be monitored and addressed at the end of the presentations. And so I'm going to disappear now and give it over to Peter Rutland.
Okay, thank you, Zsuzsa, and welcome everybody. This is a terrifically important topic, it goes without saying, and we're very fortunate in having a long-standing vASN colleague, Şener Aktürk, to present and defend his most recent analysis of the thorny question of religion and nationalism. And Dr. Aktürk has a PhD from Berkeley. He teaches at Koç University in Turkey, and he's the author of the well-received book, Regimes of Ethnicity and Nationhood in Germany, Russia, and Turkey, that was published in 2012. And he's still plugging away at this question of religion and nationalism, and his latest thoughts are in the article, which are linked, there's a link to his article in Nationalities Papers in the chat room. And the format of this workshop will be Dr. Aktürk will talk for 15 minutes maximum, and then Dr. Philip Gorski from Yale University and Dr. Oksana Cheval from Tufts will follow up with a commentary of 10 minutes each, and then we'll open the floor to the Q&A. So please be thinking about your questions and comments and posting them in the Q&A as we go. So without further ado, I will hand the floor to Şener Aktürk.
Thank you very much, Peter, Zsuzsa, Phil, Oksana, Lisa, and Lucine for organizing this wonderful session, which provides me with the opportunity to discuss my article on nationalism and religion in comparative perspective. I'll only briefly go over some of the bullet points, some of the themes that I tried to critically review, and then quickly move on in the next 6-7 minutes to the new typology I offer preliminarily to address some of these questions. The big question that frames my inquiry is the first sentence of the article and the abstract, and I shared the link to the article in the chat box. Does religion motivate and intensify nationalism, or does religion moderate and even suppress nationalism? Surprisingly enough, we actually have, maybe not surprisingly, we have theories that have opposite predictions regarding this question. Some basically implicating that nationalism actually motivates and intensifies nationalism, and many others that suggest, maybe not directly, but implicitly, that religious identities moderate, weaken, and even suppress nationalism. In the first half, or even 2/3 of the article, I review 6 kinds of relationships that exist in the extant scholarship on religion and nationalism. First is the claim that nationalism is a modern religion in competition with traditional religions. This is a big thesis, big idea. It could be, and I spent quite a bit of time going through different scholars who advanced this idea. The idea of nationalism as the modern religion can be traced back to Durkheim and Rousseau, but a very explicit statement of this thesis was provided by Carlton Hayes in his 1926 article and then 1960 book, Nationalism, a Religion. I think this is a very provocative thesis, but it is in need of systematic testing, like the other 5 bodies of literature I will point out. For example, do people who attend Sunday Mass or Friday prayers less nationalistic than those who do not? Second is the claim that nationalism relies on a religious myth of ethnic election. This is expressed most famously through the idea of the chosen people as the myth moteur of nationalism. Anthony Smith would be probably the first name that comes to mind. Phil Gorski also demonstrated this pattern in the cases of Dutch and English nationalism in his article on the Mosaic Moment, among other publications. This pattern of religiously justified nationalism as being God's chosen people is clearly observable, I think, in numerous Protestant nationalist movements, such as the English, the Dutch, and Protestant settlers overseas, such as the American Puritans, the Afrikaners in South Africa, and as a non-Protestant example, Zionists, the Jewish nationalists. But I think not much elsewhere, raising doubts about its universalizability. Particularly the conspicuous absence of a Catholic or Islamic myth of ethnic election, I think, is related to key doctrinal and institutional differences among main religions. Third is the religious exclusion as nation building thesis or corpus, especially in cases where the founding of the nation was based on a religious mobilization and exclusion, and examples range again from Greece and Turkey to Pakistan and Algeria. Relatedly, some scholars discuss the links between present-day national categories and pre-modern religious communal categories, whether, for example, Balkan nation states are secularized version of religiously defined millets in the Ottoman legal system. Examples can be multiplied. Fourth, there is a body of scholarship on religious influences on national politics and policy making, mostly focusing on the study of religious organizations' influence on government policies, as these are often related to historical legacies of national religious configurations. Again, Ana Grismala Busey's articles and books come to mind in illustrating concrete manifestations of religious influence in politics on policymaking from Croatia to Poland, Ireland to Italy, such as political decisions regarding abortion, divorce, same-sex marriage, religious education, or religious identity in official documents. Fifth, and now I'm really summarizing the next 3 and then moving on to the second part. Fifth is the influence of religious observance and specific religious rituals on national identification. I'll give just one example, a recent award-winning book from ASN, Sufyan Jemukov and Mikhail Alexeyev's book on pilgrimage to Mecca and how North Caucasian Muslim groups' pilgrimage to Mecca actually increased tolerance toward different ethnic, national, and religious groups. And opposite findings for other religious rituals have been also reported, and I refer to them in the article as well. Sixth and finally, the sixth relationship is between nationalism and religiously based civilizations transcending nationalisms, a kind of literature that was popularized, especially after Samuel Huntington's famous article, Clash of Civilizations. But this also just like the others, has not been much systematically tested. One recent example which attempted to test this is Marlene Laurel and Henry Hale's article in Nationalities papers, where they try to measure and very well the civilizational identities in the Russian context. Now I have a few criticisms before offering an alternative typology for the relationship between nationalisms and religions. My first criticism is that much of the scholarship in this field, which is kind of not very much connected, so that's a more general criticism, I won't even get to that. These 6 bodies of literature are not very much connected to each other. But my first substantive criticism is that much of the scholarship implicitly builds on the Western European experience, which is not generalizable due to the exceptional institutional separation of secular and religious authority in the Western Christian tradition, Protestant and Catholic, especially Catholic. In other religious traditions, religious authority is either subordinate to the secular authority, Orthodox Christianity, or there is no hierarchical and distinct religious authority, Sunni Islam, and or secular authority simultaneously claims religious leadership, Shintoism. Second, there's a very significant difference within Western Christianity, of course, between Catholic and Protestant traditions due to the supranational and hierarchical institutionalization of the Catholic Church, compared to the national and subnational institutionalization of Protestant denominations, which place these two traditions at the opposite poles in terms of the national religious configurations they generate, I think. Third, Western European nationalisms were premised on religious sectarian homogeneity to an extent that could not be found anywhere else in Eastern Europe, Eurasia, South Asia, East Asia, or Africa. So most of the paradigmatic case of Western nation states started out with a demography that was more or less 9900% Christian only. And this is a unique kind of starting point in comparative perspective. Fourth, I argue that the late medieval eradication of Jews and Muslims across Western Europe prefigured the sectarian and ethno-national purges of the following centuries. So in the remaining 5 minutes, I'm just going to quickly offer a new typology of national religious configurations. I argued in the article that different configurations of nationalism and religion depend on 2 critical conditions. First, the degree to which the dominant religious tradition in the nation is doctrinally supra-ethnic and institutionally transnational. And second, the religious identity of the main adversary in the constitutive conflict, usually independence war, but it could also be some other war, that culminated in national statehood. These 2 factors can be considered variables in a continuum rather than binaries, although in the tables I present, and I'll show them to you now again, they are presented as if they are binaries, but I recognize that they are really variables in a continuum. To come back to the first element, the ethno-national dimensions of religious doctrines are surprisingly understudied. For example, Judaism includes a well-known religious myth of ethnic election, the chosen people, and Hinduism includes a religiously sanctioned hereditary social order, the caste system, making Hinduism arguably the largest ethnic religion in the world. In contrast, neither Christianity nor Islam have a religious myth of ethnic election. Nonetheless, several Christian and Islamic sects have been ethnicized insofar as ethnic and religious sectarian identity become de facto coterminous, as in the case of Alawites in Syria, Alevis in Anatolia, Armenians, Assyrians, and Copts, with many adherents entertaining a subjective belief in common descent, the Weberian definition of ethnic identity. I emphasize in particular hereditary priesthood, such as the Brahmins in Hinduism, Kohanim in Judaism, and Bedes in Alevism, as another indicator of an ethnicized religion. Of course, if the entire religious confession is hereditary, that's a fully ethnic religion, like the Druze, and one could give some other examples. But this is where I'm trying to get at, with the emphasis on hereditary versus non-hereditary religions. And based on that, and here I'll try to share my screen very quickly. I think you should be able to see it. If you look at this first, table, I tried to, okay, I'm having difficulty. Okay, so in a continuum of supra-ethnic doctrine and transnational institutionalization, I placed Catholicism and Sunni Islam, and ethnic doctrine and or national institutionalization, Judaism, Hinduism, Shintoism, and Protestantism, and Eastern Orthodoxy and Shiite Islam as somewhere in the middle. So I combine this, I combine this table. I'm wrapping up in 3 minutes or so. I combine this table with the second dimension, constitutive conflicts. Constitutive conflicts interact with the doctrinal and institutional affinities of religious traditions in shaping the national religious configuration. And in fact, probably these usually militarized violent conflicts are more important than religious doctrine. Thus, a polity in which a doctrinally supra-ethnic and institutionally transnational religion, such as Catholicism, dominates, might witness a fusion of its national and religious identity if the main adversary in the constitutive conflict that led to the establishment of the nation state was of a different religion. Let me again share the table. It will be easier to understand it, I think, maybe through the table. So the main question here is, and it's a very important question, I think, probably more important than doctrine, was the main adversary in nation building the same religion or different religion? And there's a big difference here, I mean. So when we place them in this 2x2 table, on the upper right-hand corner, you see nationalisms where the dominant religion had an ethnic doctrine and or national institutionalization, usually both. And the main adversary in the War of Independence was of a different religion, like the Dutch revolt against Catholic Spanish, English against, again, Catholic hegemony in the continent, Jewish nationalism against both Christian and Muslim Arabs and Protestant British mandate, Japanese. So in this box, we should have religion and I would expect religion and nationalism to be most reinforcing. The opposite would be if the main religion is supra-ethnic and transnational, like Catholicism, Sunni Islam, and the main adversary is the same religion as the nation builder. So Colombia, you know, Spanish-speaking Catholic Christians rising up against other Spanish-speaking Catholic Christians, the Spanish Empire. Universalism clashing with nationalism. So in this case, I would expect religious and national identities to be moderating, weakening each other, pulling in opposite directions. Whereas we have the intermediate category in cases where the religion is transnational and quite supra-ethnic, like Catholicism or Sunni Islam, but the main adversary is a different religion. Irish against, you know, Protestant English, Pakistani Muslim nationalism, Polish, again, Catholic versus Orthodox Russia, Protestant Prussia, and, you know, a Muslim Ottoman Empire, or Turkish against Greek Orthodox Christian. And the other intermediary category would be if there is an ethnic doctrine or national institutionalization, Protestant in its beginnings, American and Australian nationalism, but again, rising up against an adversary of the same ethnic religious background. So this is basically these are the 4 types of national religious configurations that I proposed. In closing, I'd like to make the following remarks. In the opening pages of his magnum opus, Imagined Communities, Benedict Anderson in 1983 already suggested that Marxism lost to nationalism, as the developments in South Asia indicated already in the late 1970s, the wars between socialist regions of Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and so forth. John Mearsheimer in 2018, The Great Delusion, but also in his articles and his book, The Great Delusion, more recently argued that whenever liberalism and nationalism come into conflict, nationalism invariably wins. Perhaps the biggest unanswered question then concerns the earliest major contest nationalism had, not against Marxism or liberalism, which it's, at least according to these observances, nationalism already defeated, well before its confrontation with Marxism and liberalism, and continues to have in a post-Marxist and post-liberal world. When nationalism and religion come into conflict for the allegiances of peoples, which one emerges triumphant? Based on the experience of the last half millennium, the answer to this question may vary, depending on the specific nationalist religious configuration. In a post-socialist and post-liberal world, religions and nationalisms are likely to remain as the two most powerful contenders in the marketplace of identities. Thank you very much for your interest and for your patience. I'll be very interested and curious to hear your criticisms, comments.
Great, thank you so much, Şener. And I should explain that the panel chair is Cheryl Stroheim of the University of London. She had some communication problems earlier, but she's here now, and so I'll hand over the gavel to Cheryl.
Hello, everyone. I have to apologize. My university email server was blocking out all of the links coming in, so we literally had to use a different email. So many apologies for that. Here I am. And let's move with no further ado to Philip Gorski's comments.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to be on this panel. And Şener, thank you also for giving me the opportunity to read your paper. I've been mostly reading and writing about religion and nationalism in the US over the last 10 years and have not been following this literature as closely as I used to. And so it was really interesting and really useful to get this this excellent analytic overview and also a general framework for putting the literature into and using to pose questions. So obviously one of the aims of this article is to press scholars to think in an even broader comparative frame that goes beyond North America and Western Europe, and I certainly applaud that, but that's well out of my wheelhouse. So I'm mostly going to focus my remarks on the Western cases. And in particular, I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of ideas, and in particular of narratives, because I thought this was one area where Şener's excellent article could probably use a little bit more rounding out. And I'll also just say a little bit about the relationship between race and religion, and race and nationalism, since I think this is one of the areas where some of the most interesting work is currently being done by cultural historians and historical social scientists. So first, let me say a little bit about the chosen people's narrative. Here, I think it's important to realize that there are at least two quite distinct versions of this narrative. So there is one which I focused on in my earlier work and which other scholars have called covenantal, and which is often associated with a relatively more benign or civic form of nationalism. But I think it's important to understand that the same biblical sources can also be interpreted in a different direction and to generate a rather different narrative, which I would loosely call the conquest narrative. And this is a narrative about the Israelites entering the promised land, finding it occupied by religious and ethnic others, whom it is their right and indeed their duty to push out or exterminate if necessary. And this narrative figures just as largely as the covenantal narrative in many of the same cases that Şener talks about. So this narrative pops up in regards to the Irish during the Irish conquest. It pops up with respect to the Native Americans in the United States. It reappears in what becomes South Africa with the Boers. So there are, one way of talking about this, there's a sort of a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde quality to this Old Testament version of chosenness. Another kind of very important component to this conquest narrative version is apocalypticism, Christian apocalypticism. And a particular what we would now call literalistic interpretation of prophecies in the Old Testament, in particular in the book of Revelation, about a final cosmic battle between good and evil. And this is actually also a crucial component of the conquest narrative. In fact, I think the conquest narrative has to be understood as an amalgamation of these two narratives, generating a new narrative. And the crucial feature here is that it draws the line between good and evil, not through individuals, but between groups, and therefore provides a justification for holy war and genocidal violence. And I think this is something which is by no means unique to Christian forms of religious nationalism. The second thing I'd like to take up is Shener's interpretation of Catholicism, and the claim that there is no narrative of ethnic chosenness within Catholicism. This is right, but also a little bit wrong. And let me just give a couple of examples. So I would broadly distinguish three different forms of Catholic religious nationalism across West European history and North American history. The first is one that runs through sacred kinship. And this is the idea of, a particular king, the King of France, the King of Spain. Many of the Catholic monarchs made these claims of being the defender or the most holy, the defender of the church, or the most holy ruler within Europe, and thus having a sort of a special mission, which he carries out with his subjects to defend Christianity. The second one is a Christocentric narrative that imagines the nation as the body of Christ, and imagines national renewal through the idea of resurrection. And this is one that occurs often amongst nations who were conquered, occupied, partitioned. The two really paradigmatical examples that I would reference about this Christocentric form of nationalism are Poland. And there's been a good deal of writing about this. I would point in particular to Genevieve Szubrzycki's work, historical sociologist at the University of Michigan. But also the defeated Confederacy of the Southern states in the US. Many of you have probably heard this phrase, the South will rise again, which sounds like a cliche, but trace it back to the kind of preachers of this of the postbellum South, and they very explicitly put this into a theological frame. And the sort of early forerunners of the Ku Klux Klan call themselves redeemers, and this is the idea that they're actually going to redeem the nation through holy violence and a reestablishment of the racial order. And the third and the final one I'll point to is an understanding that focuses on the metaphor of the Sacred Heart, which is a very old one in Catholic piety. And many of you, for example, if you've been to Paris, will have seen the Church of the Sacred Heart there, which, as you may know, was built in a way as a sort of an offering to God, or as a sort of act of atonement following France's defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, which many devout Catholics actually blamed on the secularization of France. And this continues to manifest in various other contexts, certainly up to the middle of the 20th century. The other kind of nuance that I would like to put in here has to do with Protestantism, which so I think it's broadly correct what Shener says, that compared with Catholicism, there's not the same degree of supranational, centralized religious authority. But I think it's important to nuance here a little bit. So I would personally draw a sort of a continuum. At one end, we have what historians call kind of the magisterial Reformation, the state churches. So the Lutheran churches of Scandinavia, Germany would fall into this model, which basically retain the Episcopal organization, the Catholic Church, without the Pope, and in which there are relatively centralized, legitimate, authoritative spokespersons who can, in fact, speak for the church as a whole. At the other extreme, you find leader-centric forms of sectarian Christianity, and these you find, for example, especially today in Pentecostalism, which is one of the most rapidly growing movements. In between, you find congregational models and you find denominational models. So I think it's important to keep these nuances in mind, especially today, because I think it's precisely the more acephalous forms of Christianity. They're spreading the most rapidly. And these are also the kinds of Christianity which are most susceptible to what I would call cultural and political capture by entrepreneurial elites, right? So this is essentially what you've seen, for example, in the United States with the populist capture of evangelical Christianity, which is one of the things I've been studying and obsessing about for the last 10 years or so. And I think a focus on religious authority in this sense is really also quite crucial to understanding variations in the shape that Christian nationalism or Christian civilizationalism is taking in various places. Now, just very briefly reference the work of Tobias Kremer, who's a Anglo-German scholar who recently finished his PhD at Cambridge. And he draws a very interesting contrast, in particular between Germany and the United States, precisely around this, that the ability of both party elites, the Christian Democrats, and religious elites, the leaders of the Catholic and Protestant churches in Germany, to push back against attempts of populist ethno-nationalists to use the fig leaf of religion to cover up their racial animus and nativism. As opposed to the U.S., where such attempts have been relatively weak, if they've been forthcoming at all. And this touches just a little bit on the relationship between race and religion. I'd be happy to say more about this, but I've actually come to the view that it's quite difficult to really draw a sharp distinction between ethnic nationalism and religious nationalism. And this is why, instead of talking about religious nationalism or Christian nationalism, the United States context in particular, I always now just talk about white Christian nationalism, because whiteness, Christianity, native birth are so intertwined with one another, particularly in this new populist moment. I'll just now very briefly close and say something about what I think some of the broader implications of this might be. Just based on my, familiarity with non-Western cases, I think you find much the same thing. That is a very complex relationship between the establishment of religious homogeneity and ethnic othering on the one hand, and also between various forms of apocalypticism and the kind of conflicts that Şener is talking about. Indeed, one of the most striking things is that you find the emergence of apocalyptic narratives and ethno-nationalist narratives of kind of cosmic or religious origins, even in religious traditions to which they are not indigenous. And I think one of the most striking examples of this would be Buddhism in Sri Lanka, and here in particular, a reference to classic work of the late Harvard anthropologist Stanley Tambiya, Buddhism Betrayed. Thank you.
Right, really interesting comments. Thank you. And let's turn now to Oksana Shevel.
Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this panel. I was really delighted to read Şener's piece, and I'm a relative newcomer to the study of religious issues. My work has been primarily on nationalism and nation building in Ukraine and surrounding areas, but I am kind of getting more interested in this orthodox politics in and around Ukraine. So I certainly learned a lot from Şener's work, and I know like the comments I'm supposed to be critical and engaging Şener. pushing him on some of the things in the article, but I just want to say for all of you who haven't read it, I mean, this is really great, kind of, it's short and to the point, and it gives you a broad overview of the field, like Shener's groupings of these different bodies of literature, right? And then his own typology is quite compelling, even though I will raise some issues about it, but I think it's sort of in political science, we all like the 2x2 tables and how things, you know, you can sort of make predictions based on that. So his kind of theoretical typology, I think, is really helpful, even though, again, you know, not everybody might agree with sort of, you know, broader kind of claims behind it. So I am trying to keep my comments brief. I basically wanted to raise kind of three things that I, by way of kind of question / comment, and would ask Şener if he has time to comment on some of these kind of to more elaborate what he's thinking about these issues. My first set of comments kind of broadly centers around the role of the state in this analysis, right? Because when we talk about the nationalism and religion, right, these terms can have different meanings, right? And one sort of maybe most obvious distinction would be kind of at the mass level as opposed to the elite level or the state level, right? So when we're talking about nationalism and religion either reinforcing each other or, you know, potentially weakening each other, right? Are we talking about sort of popular attitudes and identities, right? And then maybe actions or mobilization that these identities might inspire, or are we also talking about sort of the state role in this process somehow? And so in a way, this, you know, Schachpol's famous call to bringing the state back in, I wanted to ask Şener, like, if he sees sort of what role does he see for the state in this interaction between nationalism and religion, right? One thing that I would, so let me elaborate a little bit what I'm going at there. So for example, this body of literature that I think in your categorization, this number 4 on the role of religious influences on national policy making. So this is sort of the chain, the causal errors go from, you know, religion influencing state policies, right? But of course, we can also think, and this is something I wanted to ask you about, like, do you think that's important? How does it fit in your overall framework of the state policies, either formal or informal, influencing what is happening in sort of religion, broadly speaking, right? Some ways, say, state policies might support or undermine capacity of religious institutions, right, or different religious denominations, which in turn would, you know, potentially would influence how they interact with nationalism, among other things, right? One potentially might even take it a step further and say that state policies can influence religious identities themselves, right? In other words, if the state, sort of this idea that people belong to certain religions is not somehow exogenous, right, to what happens at the state level, but in fact, in some ways is a product of what the state does, right? So this kind of in-group and out-group, again, is not kind of sort of emerges there organically, or at least not always, right? But could also be a direct function of the state actions, right? So states in specific ways, like either supporting a national church, right, or designating certain groups as, you know, potentially sort of privileged, better, so forth, right? So again, I can see how this is a very broad question and the connections may be multiple, but I was wondering, like, because the way I read your treatment of religion and nationalism, and again, it's a short piece, you don't really define what exactly these terms mean in your analysis, right? It sort of seems to me kind of more centered at societal level, right? And I was, you know, so that's why I was curious to hear maybe more if there's time, how do you see the state fitting into this relationship, right? Now, my second set of questions, I guess it's also somewhat related. I was wondering sort of your broader assumptions, right? About religion and nationalism underlying your analysis, right? This, in a way, echoes some of the things Philip was saying earlier, say unifying, or like do these terms, right? Like when we say about religion, nationalism, right? Is there an assumption, so say, of group unity, right? Or within the same religious or national group, there could also be quite a lot of exclusion. I mean, the most obvious example you gave in your piece, you know, was the Protestant religious denominations in the US, the segregation of the churches, right? So this way, sort of Protestantism becomes not like a unifying label, right, but potentially sort of capturing quite distinct identities and sets of interests and so forth, right? Broader kind of issue here, I think, is also something I wanted to ask you to maybe say a few words about, the potential fluidity of both religious and national identities. We, in studies of nationalism, we talk broadly, and this is sort of like, you know, everybody's kind of aware and conscious of this, that national identities may be quite muddled, right? People can have multiple and competing identities, right? There is sort of this fluidity and change there. It seems to be that the assumption about religious identities that there is less potential ambiguity, fluidity. I'm not sure if that's really the assumption in the literature. I'm not such an expert as you are on this broader literature, but I wonder, right, if we can also think about people, there are certain examples, I mean, Ukraine comes to mind, when people having really dual, multiple kind of blurred identities, right? somebody just says they're just Orthodox. I mean, in Ukraine, there are at least 3 competing Orthodox denominations, right? What does it really mean when people specifically, right, either don't identify, don't want to identify, or they may re-identify over the course, even of a relatively short period of time, sometimes as a direct result of state policies, right? So this sort of fluidity of national and religious identities, if that's indeed the case, right, does it in some way impact the typology that you're proposing, right? It might potentially complicate your typology, especially this dimension, if the main adversary has the same or different religious, religious identity. Like say, like again, I'm thinking about Ukraine, right? You put it in the category that the main adversary was the same religious sectarian identity. I guess you're referring to Ukraine kind of versus Russia both being Orthodox, right? But one could say that, Ukrainians sort of struggle for statehood also involved Poland, right? And this Greek Catholics, Ukrainian Catholics in the West, right? Like, so the identity, I guess what the point I'm making here, that, in the Ukrainian case, at least the religious identity is much more complicated than sort of everybody being Orthodox, right? And what it means to be Orthodox is really contested. And again, it may be more an unusual case, right? If you kind of look at it globally, but if it is not as unusual, and of course this fluidity and ambiguity may take different ways in different contexts, right? But if that's at least exists, I was wondering how are you thinking about it, right? Again, it's sort of this label of religious identity becomes more complex, right? And of course, we know national identity is also sometimes, oversimplification, and many things are going underneath, right? Now, the last set of questions I wanted to bring up, and that's a little bit maybe unfair because you're already talking about, you have your nice 2x2 table. You're talking about these different intervening variables, if you want to use political science language, right? That condition the relationship between religion and nationalism. So you mentioned how whether there is a supraethnic or an ethnic doctrine, right, transnational or national institutions, right, the same or different sectarian identity in the competition for statehood. And I was wondering if you maybe think that there are potentially some other intervening variables that might play a role or moderate this relationship between religion and nationalism in certain contexts. So some things that came to my mind, I mean, one is the sort of fluidity of identities. If, say, societies have more fluid, either religious and or national identities, like would that change the way the two are interrelated? Another sort of, again, from political science perspective, thing that comes to mind is regime type, right? Like, are these relationships the same or different under, say, authoritarian regimes, right, or more competitive democratic regimes? Finally, kind of the time dimension, right? You talk about past dependency, right? But one could also hypothetically at least say, well, maybe at different stages of nation building, these relationships might be somewhat different. So again, I'm not saying you should do 6 more 2x2 tables, but if you do have some thoughts about additional factors that potentially can mediate the relationship, that would be great to hear. So I'll end here. Thank you so much.
Wonderful, thank you. We're going to open it up to questions first, and then we'll allow everyone to have a response who's spoken. But hopefully we're having some more questions percolate. In the meantime, I'll ask one that has come up here by Stephen Satkiewicz. How does this connection between nationalism and religion relate to post-secular studies? That is, the study of how religion remains, but is even revived in the modern age. And go ahead and take that question as we wait for some more to come in. I would say Şener, but also the other panelists can jump in as well. And if you get out of hand, I'll do this. So, yeah.
Yes, thank you very much, Cheryl. How does this relate to post-secularist studies? I try to actually place the study of religion and nationalism in the broader context of what I call cosmology. That's why I put actually Marxism and religions in a similar category. I received a similar question earlier as well, the extent to which, I mean, how does religion and nationalism survive in the post-secular environment? The question is, I mean, they fulfill what are the alternative cosmologies there are? Right, the knowledge of the cosmos, the beginning and the end of humankind. I mean, Marxism was clearly a cosmology. A great book I can recommend right next to me, Victoria Smolkin's A Sacred Space is Never Empty. I mean, Soviet Marxism was clearly a cosmology, a quasi-religion with its rituals. It did fail But this experiment similarly shows that there is a certain function, meaning of life, to summarize it, I guess, that religion fulfills. And nationalism, as Anderson, Ganner, many others, with their emphasis on the cenotaphs, immortality, the search for immortality, emphasize nationalism also, most nationalisms also try to address that cosmological need. But, so I mean, the question of Steven Satkiewicz can be generalized to say, you know, is there a future for religions and nationalism? I think there certainly is, because there aren't many alternative cosmologies that so far resonate with collectivities, not individuals, but collectivities. So I think that's could be, at least the way I understood the question, this would be my answer, that they are here to stay. And in fact, possibly even we might even witness a further resurgence of religions and nationalism, but perhaps also as competitors.
Yes,
I can jump in and say something to this. I could say a lot to this, but I'll just say two things. I would say that religion survives in post-secular societies in the form of a strategy and in the form of narrative. So it remains as a strategy for rallying majorities, for example, in electoral politics, where it's often used increasingly as an identity marker. And then secondly, it survives often in the form of deeply embedded and resonant cultural narratives. And my favorite example here is apocalypticism. There is in US cinema and fiction an entire genre of post-apocalypticism. It's really one of the most important genres, actually, in contemporary American popular culture. And it's difficult, actually, to know where the secular version ends and the religious version begins. You can see that in the way in which a sort of version of this known as the QAnon conspiracy that some of you may be familiar with really melds and fuses these religious and secular bits and pieces of narrative and symbology. So those would be the two main ways, as a political strategy and as a cultural narrative.
I'm going to try to take questions by theme a bit, because there's a question related to this by Anatoly Tomantsev. Excuse me if I've said your name wrong. And it's a long question, but summarized, it's about the difference between organized religion in institutions with formal theology versus there's a growing body of literature showing that religious authority and religious categories are not controlled by religious institutions. So in that context, does it make sense to emphasize theology or any other formal religious differences if the differences don't penetrate the living experiences of peoples? And I was thinking of QAnon when I read that.
So maybe let me say a couple of words just on this, just my sharing thoughts on this. I think, first of all, I would say that this is a question, right? Whether they do or don't penetrate. I would imagine, I think in some context they don't, and in some context they do. In other words, sort of these theological, right, and kind of religious institutional authorities, to what extent how people experience religion, practice religion, think about religion, right, may or may not be affected by these things, right? But I would say kind of more generally, I think it depends what question we're asking, right? Because if we are asking about, say, lived experiences of people, right? And indeed there is this disconnect, then it probably indeed doesn't make sense to spend maybe potentially for that specific study, right? Too much time on theological differences, right? On the other hand, if say we are talking about how religious institutions try to influence the state and the kind of narratives they propose, right? And how they, for example, lobby for power, right? Like then maybe the religious institutions become more important. So I don't know if that's quite satisfying, you know, as far as the question that was asked, but I think first of all, I would say the very phenomenon probably is context specific. And then, you know, depending what question we really are asking, what we want to understand, it may or may not be relevant, even if it indeed is not really affecting how people experience religiosity and religion in daily life.
I think if I may comment on the proliferation of non-organized religion, as this question pointed out, the 2x2 table and in general this configuration, with this configuration, I tried to actually suggest what kind of constraints the doctrinal but also historical trajectory of different religious traditions might impose, including upon the states themselves. And this is directly actually related to Oksana's question. Since the medieval times, monarchs, secular authorities tried to nationalize religions, and this will always be the case. Philip the Fair confronted Boniface and the Avignon papacy. Vladimir Putin tries to, in the ecumenical patriarchate, autocephaly struggle, tries to nationalize the church. So there will always be a state impulse to nationalize religions. In the case of a completely non-organized new religions and religiosities, I think it can go either way. Because there is no transnational authority, at least in the hypothetical example that was given in the question, I think, then it can turn into a very ethnic, ethno-nationalistic cult, but it can also move in the complete opposite direction. The reason I emphasize the transnational versus national institutionalization is if there is a centripetal force, is there a centripetal transnational kind of force, tradition, ritual for this religion? For Orthodox Christianity, there is the patriarchate right here, So there will always be a reference point beyond borders. For Catholicism, there is, again, of course, the Vatican. For Islam, there is, in the forms of rituals, the pilgrimage to Mecca. The Malcolm X story is very well known. Nation of Islam was clearly an example of an attempt to ethnicize a religion, a kind of a black Muslim identity, but from Malcolm X's autobiography and life story, it's very well known that the pilgrimage to Mecca exerted that centripetal force and moved much of this group into mainstream kind of supranational Orthodox Islam. So with new religions and religiosities that lack or that are now innovating their organizational forms, I think the prediction would be indeterminate, because nobody can know a priori whether they'll go in the ethnic national or completely transnational direction. That's why I'm limited. Yes, this is one of the many limitations of the article is that I'm primarily talking about traditional religions of the pre-nationalist traditional religions, even, I should say. Sorry for taking too long to answer this.
On the topic of orthodoxy, we have a question from Peter Rutland, and he's actually not put it in the Q&A because we have different tech for panelists. He wants to know, Şener, why do you put orthodoxy in the intermediate category and not the nationalized category? Due to the national embedding of the Orthodox Church in Greece, Armenia, Russia, etc., long predated the emergence of Protestantism and is connected to distinct languages.
The primary reason is the existence of the ecumenical patriarchate. So even though there are these nationalized religions national autocephalous churches, and their numbers might increase in Montenegro. Now we have Ukraine as the second largest autocephalous church, but there is a centripetal force. There is the ecumenical patriarchate. So a full nationalization, ethnicization of Orthodox Christianity is theoretically, I think there's always this constraint. This is my short answer: is the ecumenical patriarchate, and to the extent that there is, church law, there is a transnational liturgy. There isn't that much. That's another, of course, indicator. again, for the Catholic Church as well, Latin liturgy versus liturgy in the vernacular, national, ethnic languages. Again, for Islam, you know, the Quranic Arabic is still the predominant form of liturgy, worship, call to the prayers from Morocco to Indonesia, from Tatarstan to whatever, Sudan, Somalia. That's another variable, and that's why I put both Orthodox Christianity and Shiite, most forms of Shiite Islam in the intermediate category. I hope this is at least answers Peter's question in part.
We now have a few questions about Islam, and I'm just going to go through and sort of, I think I'll focus on this one, but I might pick up another theme in another question. So some of the religion and politics literature discusses Islam as exceptional. This is an anonymous question. What are some of your recommendations for scholars analyzing religious nationalism in non-Christian religions, like Islam and Hinduism and Buddhism, etc., especially when confronting the norm in the political science literature to treat them as exceptional and non-comparative? In fact, I'll leave it at that. That's quite a question.
I mean, as a professional comparativist, I'm professionally biased when it comes to all claims of exceptionalisms, and especially as somebody who's studied Russia, Soviet Union, you know, the Russian idea, the Russian exceptionalism, the Germans on their way, American exceptionalism and Turkish exceptionalism. So I'm kind of almost instinctively against exceptionalisms. When it comes to exceptionalism of Islam, in fact, in the article, I kind of always find the more mainstream Sunni Islam similar in the supranational and transnational ritualistic dimension to Catholic Christianity, whereas Shiite, for example, Ismaili, Alawite, Alevi, other forms of Shiite, many of the other forms of Shiite Islam, more similar to either Orthodox Christian or Protestant Christian denomination. So basically, I find, instead of Islam and Christianity, I actually think certain branches of Islam and Christianity are similar to each other, Catholicism and Sunnism, when it comes to ethnicity and nationalism. And some branches of Islam and Christianity are similar to each other, Orthodox Christian versus Shiite Islam. So actually, I specifically try to avoid using Christian or Islam without any adjectives, because it's not, at least for the study of ethnicity and nationalism, Islam is not a very useful category, because the diversity within Islam and the diversity within Christianity, if you go back to the very first spectrum, both ends of the spectrum are occupied by different versions of Islam and Christianity. Right? On the one end of the spectrum, we have Catholicism, Sunnism. On the other end of the spectrum, we have Protestants. So I think it's, yes, so varieties of Islam and varieties of Christianity are more useful analytical categories I found, at least in this study of ethnicity and nationalism.
I feel like I want to give that answer a prize. As someone who's really a comparativist, that was a really comparative answer. And in fact, it meant that I didn't take a look next at what question I'll ask next. Let's go to, yes, a question about religion and nationalism. So, and this is a pretty broad question from an anonymous attendee. What about religious nationalism, especially Islamic nationalism? So that's related to the previous a bit.
It's a broad question. I think, again, what is the specific mechanism? One very clear identifiable mechanism, which actually Phil detailed further in his comments into different subtypes, is the chosen people's narrative. And there could be other versions. Again, I mean, because the question is somewhat open-ended, I don't know in which angle to take it exactly, but religious nationalism, when it occurs, I mean, it could fuel conflict, for example, when it is the main demarcation line, right? Again, the Irish-English conflict is a prime example, but it could also serve the opposite function between different ethnic groups that share, for example, Islam as the common religion. Right? It could serve as a peace-building role. I have argued in my book that Peter mentioned in the introduction, Regimes of Ethnicity and Nationhood in Germany, Russia, and Turkey, that appeal to Islamic brotherhood and Islamic Ummah identity was sine qua non, absolutely necessary for Turkey's Kurdish opening to be accepted by the non-Kurdish majority. Because the idea was that, yes, Kurds are 15-16%, but they are Muslim, just like the 83-84% non-Kurdish majority. And these rights, the right to broadcast, publish in Kurdish, and to have Kurdish as an elective language in public schools and so on and so forth, are a requirement of Islam. So here you see, for example, religion being used for what many, including myself, would consider progressive reforms and multiculturalism. So religion can be fuel for ethno-religious conflict, but it can also, depending on the context, can also be discursive, might provide discursive legitimacy for what appears as a progressive reform. So it's very contingent on the dyads, I think. What kind of polity we are looking at. I mean, it brings to mind many of the comments of Oksana. For example, she said, in a very diverse polity, and Ukraine might be one, right? With Greek Catholic, Uniate, Orthodox, Lebanon, and many other examples, in a religiously very diverse polity that starts out as such and fights for its independence or secession, one would expect a very secular nationalism to begin with, to bridge these differences. And I wouldn't necessarily expect a positive correlation between religiosity, any specific religiosity, and nationalism. I mean, I try to arrive at some testable predictions, right, with the 2x2 table. For example, a very obvious prediction from the 2x2 table is that I would expect, maybe this is a too easy test, religiously observant Shinto of Japan to be more proud to be Japanese, right? If we go to World Value Survey, ISSB, they have questions about how proud are you to be X, right? In that box where you have overlapping religious and national identity, I would expect in those cases, again, other factors held constant, people who are religiously observant from that religious category to also display higher levels of national pride. And the opposite, in the lower left hand side, for example, again, Levantine nationalism, Syrian Lebanese, I think higher levels of religiosity probably would indicate lower levels of nationalism in many of those. Or again, I mean, examples can be multiplied. Albania, a rare case of Albania proper, a rare case of multi-religious nationalism. Right? A Muslim majority, but a very sizable Orthodox minority and a very sizable Catholic minority, and nation builders have been Catholic, Orthodox Christian, and Sunni and Bektashi Muslim Albanians. And they have the slogan, a nationalist slogan, the religion of an Albanian is neither Christian Muslim, it is Albanianism. So this is a different type. And there I would not expect a positive correlation, but inverse correlation between religiosities and nationalisms. Long answer to a short question again, but I tried to be complete in my.
The case of Albanians is interesting, having spent time in North Macedonia, asking people, there's a political project to, well, some would put it this way, to divide the Albanians in terms of religion. So these things are not they're not static and secure, if you will. There's politics behind it as well. I'm going to turn now to a question for Philip Gorski. From apologies for Turkish names. I don't say Turkish names very well. Ovgu Ulgen. Thank you so much for the fascinating talk, and to Şener for writing the article. I have a question about the 3 types of Catholicism that Philip Gorski highlighted by drawing on examples from France, Spain, Poland, and the US. I think I missed the details, and anything on a reference for that so the person can look further, and thank you for sending the links of the books. So.
Sure. I can put a few things up into the chat on the French case as well. Was the question really just to kind of review quickly the 3 different types that I distinguished, or?
That was my understanding.
Yeah. So the first is defender of the faith. Sacred king is defender of the faith, and by implication, the subjects, qua nation, as armies of the faith. The second is what I call the Christocentric narrative that focuses on resurrection and imagines the national body as having been sacrificed or crucified, literally torn to pieces, and the job of the nation building as sort of resurrecting or reassembling the nation. And then the third was what you might call a kind of talismanic form of nationalism, which focuses around this iconography of the Sacred Heart. That is, this is a legend, medieval legend about Christ's body having been pierced by the spear of one of the Roman soldiers, and this pierced bleeding heart becomes a very important icon around which French Catholic version of nationalism rallies, and at various points in French history. And I will put something up about the Sacred Heart.
Right, thank you. And we now have a question for Oksana Shevel in regards to her point about the influence of the state on religious identity. This is an anonymous question. Does it matter whether the state is stronger than the organized religion in the country? How do we know whether the state is influencing religion more or vice versa? There seems to be so much endogeneity that is hard to disentangle the relationship. How do we disentangle this relationship empirically?
Yes, thank you for the question. The short answer is that I don't know how to do this, and I agree with the points in the question that it is indeed a lot of endogeneity. I mean, my sort of maybe not very fair comment, because I sort of threw it in Şener's court and say, okay, you tell us how to figure this out, right? But I guess sort of 2 things I'll say. So first of all, that I do think that the state is an important piece in this relationship between religion and religiosity and nationalism, right? How exactly it's important, it is indeed very difficult to untangle. What I would say that one possible way kind of around it is to focus on distinct time period, right? Because something that is, like, yes, there may be kind of, how to say it, like endogeneity problem, right? But if we define our research agenda and kind of focus clearly, like I would sort of, say, an example, if you are studying the influence of state policies on religious identity or kind of religious life in the country, right? A certain period in time, it is true that whatever happened before would influence sort of what's happening now. But at the same time, it seems to me it is still defensible to say, like, okay, with that in mind, we can still see at this period in time, is the state, as you put it in the question, quote unquote, stronger? I mean, I guess we'll have to figure out what that means, right? And especially if the state may privilege, and that's also the case in countries with multiple sort of divided religious identities, that different political actors who would maybe in control of the state at different time periods would actually privilege potentially different religious groups in the country, right? So it's not sort of like this state is kind of this one thing promoting certain religious identity at all times, right? It sort of gets even more complicated. It would be different preferences. And I saw there was a question about Montenegro, this competing Orthodox groups, right? And the same happens in Ukraine. So the short answer to it is that it's indeed a big challenge. And I agree with everything that was put in the question. But I think one potential way about it is to kind of define your terms and your research agenda very clearly and say, okay, like in this period of time, like we can actually talk about these causal connections, right? Even though they may have been influenced, right, with the success of these connections or the nature influenced of what happened before, right? So that's what I would say.
Right, thank you. Montenegro has come up a few times, so I'm going to count that as answered just to get to the other ones. We have two questions on violence versus peace. And the first is from Julia Brel-Fournier. Mentions that Robert Kaplan predicted people would continue to need religion in their lives, regardless of all the modern technologies, because the virtual world did not unite people, but on the contrary, made them more alienated and lonely. Do you think there'll be more violence in the world caused by religious beliefs and nationalist ideas in the future? And then we also have a question by Amra Panjo, scholar from University of Sarajevo in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and working on a PhD on the potential for religion for peace building in divided societies. I'd like to ask for examples where religious actors really act against nationalism. I'm specifically interested in cases of Northern Ireland and Lebanon, but also in general.
I mean, the first is a difficult question, the future of violence and how much nationalism and religion as opposed to other sources might play a role there. I don't know. I mean, the short answer is I don't know. I did share the article I wrote on the uses of Islam as a discourse for the Kurdish, Alevi, and non-Muslim Armenian reforms and openings in Turkey in the chat box. I do recall some similar studies from, but I don't recall their names, so I can't put them in the chat box right now. But again, I'm kind of going back to the similar, to a similar point, but we can think of the civil rights movement. I mean, clearly this was a case where religion was mobilized both as discourse and mobilization strategy for probably one of the most important positive turning points in American history in the last century. So these kinds of, likewise, even prior to the Civil War, when we look at the origins of humanitarianism, the anti-slavery movement across the Atlantic, they had religious leaders from both sides of the Atlantic advocating abolition and emancipation, as far as I remember. So these kinds of examples come to my mind. I'm sorry I blanked on the names of the books and articles, but the cases of civil rights and the end of slavery could be mentioned. If I may very briefly mention, because it came up, the three types of Catholic nationalism that Phil mentioned came up several times also in the Q&A. And I do find the French example, French medieval kingship, very significant as well. So because it's a kind of, it's an early example of trying to achieve this kind of, Philip the Fair was the first one who routinely depicted himself as the most Christian king, if I remember correctly, and I could point out to Kantorowicz, The King's Two Bodies, or Masnak's Crusading Peace, where they talk about this new notion of the sacred kingship in France. But what I do observe in these Catholic examples is still not nationalism, because it's the king, it's the monarch. So elevating an entire ethnic community defined by subjective belief in common descent to the mythical level of the new chosen people is what I did not encounter in Catholic nationalisms or Islamic nationalisms yet. There might be, I'm not saying I've been exhausted in my search, but that's why I kind of distinguish between the sacred kingships, which you observe in many, many different religious traditions, versus considering the entire community as elevated and chosen. And Nation as the Body of Christ, a recent 2015 book I reviewed by Nicholas Terpstra, Religious Refugees, dwells on Corpus Christianum as a powerful metaphor in medieval Europe for the community, that the entire community forms the body of Christ. It's a powerful religious political metaphor, and it has negative connotations too, because then non-Christians are seen as foreigners in that body, but still it's not ethnic. I mean, here for me, the key is how hereditary is this? That's why I emphasized examples like the Brahmins or the Kohanim. How easy is it for a complete outsider, and could be any of us, to convert and become the religious notable of this new religion? It's fairly possible theoretically, but also practically in these missionary universalizing religions like Catholicism, Sunni Islam. In some other religious traditions, it's almost impossible. And in some of them, it really is impossible. I mean, there is no way I think I can be a Brahmin as somebody who doesn't come from this kind of genealogy of Brahmins. And for some religious sectarian traditions, that's, I think, true for the entire group. Druze come to mind again as an example. So this is, it's a continuum, but how easy it is to enter and exit and rise up. People have criticized me for saying, you know, Catholicism is ethnic. Look, the popes are mostly Italian. Yes, they are mostly Italian, but and the patriarchs are Greek. Yes, they are mostly Greek patriarchs and mostly Italian popes, but theoretically, anybody can convert and rise up in the ranks of the Catholic Church or the Orthodox Church and become the patriarch. And there are examples of it, right? So this is I think, both a theoretical and empirical kind of test, litmus test I also bear in mind comparatively. Thank you.
Okay, this is the free-for-all moment when I take the last questions and throw them out there and see what sticks. So the first is from Ekaterina Klimenko. My question refers to the memory boom of the last 20 to 30 years. Can you comment on the interrelations between nationalism, religion, and memory, particularly how religion affects the building of national historical narratives, and how religious memories, for example, memories of martyrdom, which is a good one, are employed to bolster national identities? And that leads into a question from Anatoly Tokmantsev about Rogers Brubaker and his idea of special affordances that religion communicates to nationalism. For example, religiously framed nationalist conflict tends to be more violent than a linguistically framed nationalist conflict. Do you agree religion has a stronger mobilizing potential? And if so, can it be that elites choose to frame the nationalist project in religious terms in order to ensure its success? And lastly, from, apologies for Turkish names, I'm not very great at pronouncing, Zeynep Tuba Sungur, is it really plausible? I like this one. This is the meta question to end with. Is it really plausible to put religion and these other isms into the same category? Ideologies may offer cosmologies, yes, but where is the transcendental beings that people pray to? And accept certain things. And so basically the lack of a being in these ideologies to pray to seems to be missing. So how can we compare those? And those are the questions I have.
I think they are related, especially the violence, linguistic versus religious violence, and the cosmologies question. I slightly disagree in that I do consider Marxism as a powerful cosmology for which millions of people have died. So we don't need to think in terms of traditional religion and its being. There is a line of research, many scholars who have conceptualized Marxism in these quasi-religious terms. George Breslauer had an article, 2 articles in Post-Soviet Affairs last year and the previous year, conceptualizing the CPSU, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, in the same terms as the Roman Catholic Church Reformation and the CPSU's reform, just came to my mind. So I will defend putting these isms together with religious cosmologies. That being said, it is of course debatable whether liberalism, because such a loose term, offers a cosmology. I mean, does it? So again, the litmus test is, does this ism have certain recommendations from family life to economic life, and some theory about the origins of humankind and the end of humankind, again, bringing in apocalypse and messianism and all of this. I think Marxism had all of this. I mean, the stages of humanity, the image of the future, communism. Nationalism, I do think it fulfills some of this, and that was the Garner-Anderson point about immortality. I die, but the Hungarian nation lives. I die, but the Portuguese nation lives, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, no, I don't think religious wars will necessarily be the bloodiest. Again, a very, I mean, the bloodiest wars of the 20th century, were they religious wars? Again, National Socialism, the Second World War. On the one side, you have a really existing socialism. On the other side, you have National Socialism. Yes, Hitler did describe his, and there's a new book on that, joining Hitler's crusade, European nations and the war on the Soviet Union, but not really, especially on the Soviet side, where you don't really have a religious effort. So I disagree with the general kind of assumption that religious warfare will always be more violent. So I think I've given at least 2-3 different answers. It could be, but not necessarily. The fact that religions usually have a cosmology, not usually, almost always by definition have a cosmology, increases that potential. Yes, people won't kill and die for 5% versus 10% tax rates. Yes, that's true. But all the other isms we are talking about are quite different. Thank you very much for your patience.
I just want to see if Philip Gorski or Oksana Shevel have anything to add to this, just to keep it brief. And apologies for the fireworks in Britain.
I'll just jump in very quickly and say something about the religion versus language question. If you want to hear my thoughts read my thoughts about that in more detail, I put in a brief a link to a brief piece rejoinder that I wrote to Roger's article on that a while ago. But in that article, he makes the, to me, rather a startling claim that language is not a structure of authority. And I understand what he means. I mean, he's using language here in the sense of German versus French, but particularly coming from a Bourdieusian like Brubaker, the notion that that class and other forms of power and authority are not deeply encoded in the ways in which we use and mobilize language is a bit incredible. And I would simply point to the degree to which certain words in the US context and also more broadly have become extraordinary flashpoints. And one of the, in contemporary politics, and one of the reasons for this, of course, it's cynical political manipulation, but I mean, the reason why the manipulation is effective is because it mobilizes differences in class, status, income, and above all, education. The whole sort of backlash against political correctness is, amongst other things, a reaction to people's resentments about being told which words to use and not use, and how and when to use them. And so I think there is a contemporary politics of language. It's not the historic politics of language that Brubaker is referencing, but it evokes every bit as much anger and violence as something which is rooted in religion per se.
Oksana.
I'll just offer one quick thought on Ekaterina's question about nationalism, religion, and memory, and preface it by saying I haven't really thought about it that much, but the thought kind of occurred to me as I read this question. And I was wondering if it might make sense, at least in some context, to think of memory as more kind of like a mechanism that might, strengthen either religion or nationalism or relationship between the two, right? Because clearly, I think what Katerina is saying does happen, that this national historical narratives are built, with certain religious memories in them, right? But again, this is a constructed process, right? It's not necessarily happens everywhere, right? Like, who constructs these narratives, right? Is it sort of, are they organically emerged? Like, do elites construct them, political elites, secular elites, right? Or religious elites, or some combination of these? So I was just, again, it's not a well thought out thought, but I just kind of was thinking that maybe that's one way to link the three, right? Like, to sort of think of these memory narratives as potential mechanism that itself would need to be analyzed, and that in turn would affect the relationship between religion and nationalism.
On the topic of constructed, the reason there are fireworks in Britain is to celebrate a failed terrorist plot to blow up Parliament. I'm really not making that up. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Zsuzsa Csergő, who is the head of this enterprise, really.
Thank you so much. I've been here listening as a nationalism scholar, but now I'm putting my director of virtual ESN hat on. And I'd like to, well, first of all, thank you so much, our panelists, for this really super exciting conversation. Not that we are not already excited in the questions that we are studying, but you have made it, you have really turned it into a learning experience for all of us, I think. And so thank you very much. Professors, Cheryl Stroschein, Peter Rutland, who was here at the beginning, Şener Aktürk, of course, and Philip Gorski, Oksana Shaval. This has been wonderful. Thank you also attendees for being here and motivating us and asking those great questions. And we did promise that we will end at 2:30, so I will just say here at the end that I hope you will be coming back to Virtual ESN. The next event is next week. Actually, we don't usually have an event every week, but it just so happened that we are going to have one next week. One of the big themes of Virtual ESN this year is the collapse of the Soviet Union, for a good reason. It happened 30 years ago. And so we are going to be discussing a book that addresses that through a book by Orenstein Gotzi titled "Taking Stock of the Shock," and it was published this year by Oxford University Press. And I also want to remind everyone of the deadline for proposals to be submitted to the ESN's annual convention. The deadline is November 17th, and of course, Virtual ESN is a branch of the broad ESN enterprise. And so please remember to submit proposals to the convention by November 17th. Thank you, and hope to see you back.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you for coming.
Bye. Thank you, Senator, and everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Got there in the end. Well done, Şener.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you, Cheryl.
You held up through a real grilling there.
Thank you. I tried.
Yeah, see you.